Okay, well, it's 5 minutes after the hour, so why don't we get started? So I'm Tony Meadow, your host for the evening, and tonight we have, I think, a very special talk. And then there's a number of other speakers that I've got lined up further out. I'm still working on dates, but those announcements will appear on the Iron and Steel Heritage Forum mailing list. So speaking of which, this is how you do that. So you can either send an empty email to that ridiculous looking email address there, or you can send an email to me and I can add you directly. But please feel free to tell your friends all about how to do this and how to get onto this list so they can also watch monthly talks on iron and steel. So tonight's talk is a really important one because it deals with the West Point Foundry of New York, which is a very historic foundry that played an important role in America's history. And it also had a second role in the history of the SIA and in terms of the, I guess, the education for many industrial archaeologists who actually dig things out of the ground and figure out what the heck they do. So this should be a look at the past for some of you who actually been through this, but for many people who did not go through the program at MTU, this will also explain why so many people from MTU spent time in New York. And because the topic is so important, we have two speakers, not just one. So Aaron Kotlinski went through the master's program and served his time at West Point. He now works for PennDOT and does some cool things there in terms of dealing with archaeology for the projects that PennDOT does. And then Steve Walton is a professor at MTU and teaches in the department that's responsible for people getting degrees in industrial archaeology. And he has a lot of interests, some of which are connected in several ways with the West Point Foundry. So they'll be passing the ball back and forth as they go through things. And if you have any questions, please type them into the chat window. And then Steve and Aaron will deal with those as as their talk ends. So.
All right. Aaron and I are going to tag team it. We have not rehearsed what we're doing, so it's a bit back and forth.
Right.
Tony did ask us to foreground the archaeology, so really Aaron will be talking most of the time. But this is perhaps, and Aaron will say this repeatedly, perhaps one of the most extraordinary sites in, we'll say, the United States for industrial archaeology potential. It was only, as it were, mined for that for about a decade, slightly less than that by Michigan Tech. Two other periods before that had some interest in it. It could be an astounding place to do more for many years to come. Aaron tried to make that his career, but his career moved in other directions in some ways. And Michigan Tech, although we have, projects come and projects go, and Pat Martin, who's on the call, is the driving engine behind the West Point Foundry project. It'd be wonderful to get back there. I don't know that Michigan Tech is likely to ever have that happen again. But Aaron, your thoughts?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So, as Steve said, my opinion is, archaeologically speaking, it is an extremely extraordinary site. And you're going to see a lot of stuff here that you just can't see anywhere else. We don't like to dabble in superlatives a lot, but in terms of both what this site has to offer and the effort we threw at this thing was a lot of so much work we put into it. I don't know. I'm going to go on a limb here and say, in terms of earth moved, words written, money spent, it was probably the biggest dirty industrial archaeological endeavors since going back to, I don't know, Roland Robbins with Saugus in the late 40s and early 50s. And so what you're going to see here is that at first the site was kind of, well, oddly enough, sort of forgotten about in a way in the early 20th century. And then beginning as things roll around into the mid 20th century, especially after the creation of the National Historic Preservation Act and the designation of the site as a National Historic Site, no, excuse me, a National Register listed site in the early 70s, people started scratching their chins and looking at it again, saying, "Hey, what's going on with that old industrial site around the corner there in Cold Spring in the Hudson Valley?" So let's before we get a little farther, just a little flavor of what you can see here on the left. There is a I think of maybe a copper plate, early copper plate letterhead imprint of the foundry, and is focused on its casting house and its boring mill to the right. And this was kind of like the foundry showing off its abilities fairly early on. And in the foreground there, you see cannon boring machinery of the period in a very caricatured way. And on the right is a view of the foundry and a photograph. I believe, I don't know if it's a tintype or of the period, but probably the late 1860s and after 1865, because we can tell there's a building that appears there that was built. And in the photo, if we could really zoom in, you'd see a lot of cannons. This is the Civil War period. This is the height of the foundry, just kicking butt in the in its own sphere of industry. So we're going to get more into the area there. So go ahead and advance the slide, Steve.
And let me just say, it is true that the cannon boring machinery is foregrounded here, but it is quite important that there is a cast iron gate or fence post leaning on it and a cast iron sewer pipe, water main pipe behind. This is not just a military foundry, although it's true military production largely sustained it throughout most of its life.
Right.
You remember going to West Point Foundry in Cold Spring?
Yeah, definitely.
This is
Time to do some printing.
There we go.
So, well, we get into a little bit here, but in terms of the archaeology, the extraordinariness of the archaeology is that it's a pretty good survivor in terms of its integrity versus a lot of its peers of the period. So it was, depending how you look at it, how the numbers roll out, is it the absolute biggest in terms of output, dollars it's intaking, weight of castings, etc.? Is it the most outstanding foundry, machine shop, forging complex of its period? It could be, but it competed in a very small class of peers, two of which we depict here. The site on the left there is the site of the South Boston Iron Works in Boston, and it's now a MBTA rail yard that's covered up the site and perhaps largely graded most of it. And pretty close from where I live here in the north side of Pittsburgh, near the David L. Lawrence Convention Center and within practically baseball throwing distance of the Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh, was the site of the Fort Pitt Foundry. Both of these were friendly competitors of the West Point Foundry from the early 19th century, the 18 teens, into the Civil War period. And they're both basically have not much in the way of archaeological integrity. I say that, though, with an asterisk. Neither have been archaeologically tested, but given the development after the fact, I doubt there's much there with ample enough integrity for it to warrant a kind of investigations like we did with the West Point Foundry. So next slide. All right. Oh, yeah, there's this other place that some folks have talked about and I know a lot about, the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, Virginia. That was a big manufacturer of cannon for the U.S. government, Navy, and I think Army as well before the Civil War. Of course, during the Civil War, its story really blooms in terms of being a producer of cannon for the Confederate States Army and Navy. And also, interestingly, the Tredegar was trying to manufacture duplicate copies of the West Point Foundry's standout cannon, the Parrott gun, with some pretty mixed success, and Steve can get more into that. But Tredegar does have pretty good integrity in terms of that central casting building, which of course now I believe is the Civil War Museum of Virginia is housed in there. But a lot of the archaeology of the period that in Tredegar was really kind of a peer of the West Point Foundry was later destroyed. Tredegar does go on to continue to be a pretty important foundry and multifaceted iron and steel working place into the 20th century beyond the time of the West Point Foundry. But its importance had largely faded, and it was doing some sideline stuff. So it's just something, of course, worth noting here. So, and Tredegar starts a generation later than the West Point Foundry. It's the 1837, if I recall right. So, but I'm happy to duke it out with anybody who wants to say who's more important, the West Point Foundry or Tredegar. So, conversation for another time. So, Where in space is the West Point Foundry? It's effectively anchored right in the middle of the mid-Hudson Valley, about a 90-minute ride up the Hudson River, formerly the North River, up from Manhattan. And there we go, zoom in a little bit more, and very nestled right in the Hudson Highlands there in that rumpled bedsheet topography. That's going to have some importance for it. A lot of that topography and that rumpled geology contains a lot of great magnetite iron ore that's going to feed furnaces around the furnace, yep, especially down there in what is now Harriman State Park to the southwest, and Fawnstalk State Park on the Cold Spring side of the river. And that feeds a lot of furnaces in the area that aren't necessarily connected with the West Point Foundry, but those furnaces demonstrate that this is an area that can generate iron for a place like the West Point Foundry in case supplies get cut off, like you have, well, the Rev War, but then later on during the War of 1812, when look around and see how well the British, the Royal Navy is able to cut off American supplies, where are you going to put a foundry? And this place makes sense. So, Steve, do you want to talk a little bit about that early history and how?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to mention that the where my cursor is there between New Windsor and Newburgh, there was an attempt, and they built a cannon foundry during the War of 1812, the Townsend Foundry. It failed. He couldn't make it work, even though the Townsends had major ironworks. Oops, sorry, went backwards somehow. Major ironworks up here in the near Harriman State Park that Aaron mentioned. In fact, they're the ones who manufactured the chain across the river at West Point that blocked the British from controlling the Hudson. But there had been a long interest in this down here near Peekskill. Robert Livingston had ironworks, and the Ancrum works are just a bit off the map to the north. So this was perhaps one of the three, if not the most important iron producing regions in America post-revolution up to about 1815 when our story kicks off. But on to the site itself. So there's West Point. This is the U.S. Military Academy today. That wasn't there at the time, although West Point was important in the Revolution. And this is the little town of Cold Spring and Nelsonville above it. And the key thing is this roughly north-south, pretty close to north-south brook that goes through here called, not surprisingly, Foundry Brook, or it's Foundry Brook once they build this thing. You'll see much better maps in a minute, but the key thing to recognize is this is a tiny little, today, sort of New York bedroom community and weekend getaway, cute little town. No other way to put it. Right next to, and this is the sort of incongruous thing, historically, that was a massive industrial valley. I mean, this is the equivalent of something in Pittsburgh by comparison, although a generation and more before that.
Yeah. Right. And so we skipped ahead of ourselves a little bit because it's just so much to get into. But so the foundry, just to give some dates and that kind of framing, the foundry ground is broken in 1817 for construction. Plans are burbling up before that year, and particularly around a merchant by the name of Gouverneur Kemble, who has a long lineage with a multi-generational lineage with merchants in the New York City area. And he has an interesting backstory. Steve can get much more into that. We probably don't have a lot of time to get into that today, but Gouverneur had enough political connections with DC at the time, in particular with the administration of initially James Madison, but then James Monroe, as the federal government was getting to scratch its head and look around in the aftermath of the War of 1812 and say, we have a problem, we have a deficit with being able to generate enough ordnance for land, but particularly for the Navy and also for seacoast fortifications. What are we going to do about that? And part of that came out of that was this idea of seeding money into an establishment somewhere well enough inland that it couldn't be taken by a foreign adversary like what the British did to the Principio Ironworks in Maryland in their raid on DC. So that lesson was learned. So a place like Cold Spring was figured out in fairly short order, and they had tapped Gouverneur Kemble because he had some experience with slash knowledge of casting. Was he himself a true born industrialist? No, but he knew people and he knew how to draw people in, and he knew how to draw funding in. So, and that's an area that Steve can talk a lot more to. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Steve.
I think we'll pass over that. We can come back to it if anybody
Sure,
cares.
sure.
But this is my attempt at a ham-handed phrase. What Kemble and his brother Gouverneur and his brother William build up is what I'm going to call a dispersed integrated foundry and machine shop, because from the beginning they had a major machine shop down at the foot of Beach Street on the Hudson in New York City. That's where they did their final assembly, their fine fitting. That's where they assembled, for example, the first railway locomotive constructed in the U.S. That's where they did a lot of their, we'll just call it general machine shop work. But all of those castings came out of their production site up in Cold Spring. So since our archaeology is in Cold Spring, we'll focus on that. The additional thing I would add about technical skill is that Aaron put it kindly that Gouverneur may have had some casting knowledge, but most of that seems to rest on the fact that he was college educated at what is now Columbia, King's College. But I would propose that it's not, he didn't know it. What he knew was people who knew it. So in particular, of the consortium that got this going, you have Joseph Gardner Swift, who is major military leader, who's trying to get contracts and get something going in New York State. Somehow they know Governor Trumbull of Connecticut, who's trying to get things going because Salisbury can't do it anymore. Kemble and his brother both know James Renwick, who is the leading steam engine expert who teaches at Columbia. So to overstate maybe, I would say the Kembles don't know anything about technical iron production, but they know people who do. They find immigrants, particularly William Young from Ireland, Northern Ireland, who knows how to do this. And they're the money guys. They're the politicos. They're the money guys. They get this whole thing built up, and boy, does it work well. So here's what we get. This is one view. We'll see a couple of better views in a moment of that industrial cove on a modern topo map becomes the West Point Foundry. First ground broken for the central buildings in 1817. They get going in production in 1818. They expand, they expand, they expand. And this is roughly the midpoint here, this picture of the sort of midpoint before their next big expansion for the Civil War. And then there's another even bigger expansion after the Civil War, although oddly they're not doing so well at that point. So here it is at its near peak, 1887. The original core is right in this area. You can see gun boring. There's a giant water wheel. I'm not sure I kept a picture of that, but anyway. Argued, or it is said, largest water wheel in America at the time. It's certainly one of the biggest. That may be a George Washington slept here sort of thing. But it was a very big and very powerful water wheel. Two giant casting areas with air furnaces and things like that. Over here, machine shops, forge shops, large water power system we'll get to in a minute. And then Aaron mentioned the building that was built during the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War is the big, beautiful office building, which still stands. I left this in there, but not terribly important. We've told you the early part. The key things I would point out is that there's initial burst of activity in the 18 teens into the 20s. There's a big shift when Robert Parrott, who was a West Point graduate but resigned his commission to take over as superintendent of the foundry, side parentheses, also to marry one of the Kemble daughters. So, which is driving which? Unclear. And he pushes the foundry into the next level. And so here you can see by 1850, the census values the plant in converted contemporary dollars, 20 million with 20 million output in that for that year. Civil War pushes them to the next level, but at the same time, it in a sense kind of damns them because they shift to entirely ordnance production. And then when the war's over, oops, nothing left to do. And they struggle along for a bit. We won't talk about that here. Kemble and Parrott die in the 1870s. It goes on to the children. Frankly, they don't do as good a job of it. Little pre-advertisement. Come to our East Broadtop SIA fall tour, and you will see one of their follies and attempted attempts to join modern iron and steel production that failed. At any rate, they're bought by JB and JM Cornell, which is a New York City structural ironworks thing. Cornell Works built more buildings, covered the space, built more out into the marsh, picture coming up in a second. When I visited the Cornell Works, they're now in Mountaintop, PA, near Stroudsburg. The descendant, second generation, third generation, he said, yeah, company lore pretty much believes that buying the West Point Foundry was the biggest mistake Cornell Brothers ever made, because it was, by that point, it was just a giant white elephant. Iron industry had moved on. Some other minor uses into the 20th century, and it's basically derelict until Scenic Hudson gets it. So this is what Aaron and I are good at doing in tag teaming. Aaron is at the top here, which I didn't check. Are you in that picture, Aaron?
No, that's from 2007, but I'm there in spirit. I'm there.
Yep. Exactly. But there's Pat Martin standing in front of the stack, or the pillar there. And this is me loading the Kemble family papers into my little VW Golf to drive them to the State Archives in Albany. And just so you know, 17 banker's boxes and 3 people will fit in a VW Golf. So it's a great little car. This is our trick. And this is the advertisement for Michigan Tech IA, now Industrial Heritage and Archaeology program, trying to merge history and archaeology. It doesn't always work perfectly, but that's our goal. And we like to say you don't know who to look at until you literally dig into the site, and therefore we are the collision of dirt and documents. Or so we try to be.
Here, here.
Yes. So, Aaron, on to art and production.
Sure. So this is one of the things that make us feel this is where we do edge into feeling pretty superlatively about the West Point Foundry. Steve, your comment noted about Burden's wheel in Troy, absolutely by far more powerful than what the West Point Foundry had with its 36-foot diameter wheel. In its early days, like 18 teens, 20s, maybe it was the most powerful wheel, but of course, yeah, there's ones that eclipse it pretty soon thereafter. So, and also a reminder, please keep dropping questions and we'll get to them somewhere during the presentation or at the end. So good questions so far. All right, so yeah, superlatives. I would say, I'll throw it out there, the West Point Foundry probably inspired some of the best industrial art of the mid-19th century. And here's the example, the gun foundry. Perhaps a remarkable painting, I don't know, in dimension, like 3 feet by 4 feet, hangs in the Putnam History Museum today and is really quite a sight to behold. The foundry isn't there in operation. This is a pretty good stand-in here. So what we see is the interior of the casting house in the Civil War period, and you're seeing several founders pour a gun into the flask there. It's casted vertically. There's two casting pits. On the left, you see one being cast. On the right, you see, very interestingly, there's a water cooling apparatus attached to the top of the casting flask. And there's a lot to get into with that, and some of you may be familiar with this, but the West Point Foundry, along with the Fort Pitt Foundry here in Pittsburgh, perhaps the South Boston Iron Works too, Steve,
Probably.
where the only foundries, well, there may have been one or two others, who are using this process of using a water cooling system to cool cannon tubes from the inside out, as opposed to the other way around, to allow for greater compressive forces as the casting would cool, and allow for a more reliable cannon that wouldn't crack as much, but also when you could put more powder, more propellant in, and fling your projectile, your projectile through your rifled tube farther and with more devastating effect. So John Ferguson Weir, who painted this, whose father was taught at the military academy, correct, Steve?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We're brother.
Brother, okay. Did a lot of work on this painting. It took him a couple years to come up with the sketches, to put together some crayon composites. And he was doing this on commission by Robert Parrott, who wanted this painting, including another one you'll see here soon, to document effectively what the foundry was looking like at its height there in the Civil War. Well, they didn't know its height, but it was a lot going on. There's also some things, even for the period. By this point, the foundry is a little bit behind some of its up-and-coming peers that are coming around elsewhere. They're using a timber jib crane in the middle to move castings around. A lot of the work here is being done by hand. Some of this is beginning to be supplemented by steam-powered winches and what by this point. Definitely in Britain and France and what's going to become shortly Germany are doing things a little bit more mechanically. But this is the foundry style at the point, and this does a lot to document that. A scene you see in the lower right corner is you've got to give a little hat tip to your sponsor. There's Gouverneur Kemble seated. Next to, just behind him, is Robert Parrott himself. Red dressed person, is that perhaps Mary Parrott?
I've always assumed it's Mary Parrott. Yep.
And then next to then there's an officer, perhaps the supervising officer. The U.S. Army would keep an officer of usually a captain rank there to supervise production of cannon through the war period. That's how Robert Parrott actually came to know the West Point Foundry well. He was in that position before he was tapped as superintendent in 1836, 37. So this painting has a lot going on, and Betsy Fallman did a wonderful book, Labor, the Art, Labor. I'm butchering the title. I'm looking behind me because I know it's behind here. It was just John Ferguson Weir's name of the book, and she gets a lot more into it. So again, we could do a whole presentation on this piece of art. So, but you can see to the right here is an interior view of the pattern making shop of about the same period, showing several carpenters or pattern makers making patterns that are going to be used in the casting house. And for me, I like the contrast between this because Parrott et al. Understood that a piece of artwork like what Weir produces here captures in a different feel. It hits differently versus a photograph of the period. Photographs are great, but my goodness, what does this piece of art do for you? I mean, and still to this day, again, I can't really urge you enough. You find yourself in Cold Spring, go to the Putnam History Museum, pay the fee, make a donation, and just stand there for a half hour, maybe not that long, and really take in this painting. There's a lot going on there. So, next slide before I blather on anymore.
Yep.
So Weir made a companion painting to this, the forge. What's the title? The forge shop.
The forge shop, or at the hammer.
Yeah, it's something very simple, just like the gun foundry, and similar to this, just outside of the casting shop, just to the north, beyond the gun foundry, beyond the foundry and the boring mill, is the forge shop, which was a really key important part of what allowed the foundry to do some really dynamic stuff that another smaller combo foundry machine shop couldn't do. They could forge big stuff. And here we see them forging a shaft for likely for a steam propelled propeller propelled vessel, whether it was inland navigation or ocean going, not sure. But this largely, and you're going to see basically this style of forging operation upscaled greatly as the 19th century goes on into the 20th century. And you can see the shaft is being heated up I believe it's a muffle furnace to the left. And you'd have all these fellows here who had the job of both manipulating and counterbalancing the piece to be worked, swing it out with the jib crane, which feels a bit oversized in the way Weir has depicted it, swing it around and put it underneath the steam-powered hammer on the right side of the painting there to then continue to forge it into its near finished dimension. So just had to touch on this a bit. Again, we could go at length of this. And you see a little New York Daily Herald piece here about the forge there in 1840. So,
just some other quick images. There is the water wheel picture. So Steve is quite right. The Burden wheel got bigger, but this is an 1818 wheel, so pretty darn big for its time. This is a view looking down into the boring shop. On the right over here is a Parrott gun on the floor, I guess, waiting for the next thing. Some cannon on the lathes here, but so big, heavy integrated machine shop. And from this position, if I have my orientation right, quite literally right through the back wall here is the foundry where those cannon are cast.
And Ted, thank you. You're exactly correct. The title is Forging the Shaft. That's right. Yep.
Now, if you were to go up the hill, uphill a little bit, is an area that Aaron is very much
in favor
of. This is a painting by John Gadsby Chapman, friend of the family and noted Hudson River artist, of the actual iron furnace at the top end of the property. Those of you on this call don't know the iron furnace, but in case someone's watching this, main stone stack here, wooden casting shed below, wooden charging bridge and house above. These are the bellows, as it were. They're cylinder bellows, we know, and you can see there's a large water wheel in there. That's an undershot, as I recall, Aaron. If pretty sure they showed that.
It could be a pitchback. It might be. It would be. I think it's a overshot or pitchback. Yeah.
And in a later slide, you'll see when we get to the archaeology part, which we should get on too fast. Very
Yeah, we
important thing.
can.
This furnace itself was notable enough that in 1850, it literally made the book on iron, Overman's Manufacture of Iron. They specifically pointed out the Cold Spring blast furnace. This thing was notable for its size. It was taller and wider in the Bosch, was it, Aaron? You know this better than
A
I
little
do.
at 9 feet, 9 feet in width. It was a bit wider than your average furnace. Yeah.
Yep. So
Yeah.
important in that way. Oops,
Yeah,
sorry.
my thesis work with the West Point Foundry in 2005 was focused on the blast furnace here, and if I hit the lottery and I have big money, we're going back there and finishing excavating because there's a lot more work to be done. It's a lot of site. It's a site with a lot of questions still to be answered. But one of the things that's really interesting that in terms of this multifaceted site, you can either casting metal, they're machining it, they're forging stuff. So that exists, South Boston Iron Works, Fort Pitt Foundry, Tredegar, and whatnot. But none of those sites had their own blast furnace on site. While this furnace, they only operated this furnace on site from 1827 to 1844 by document sources. It still showed their desire to be self-reliant. And they also have other furnaces that they own or control in some measure in the immediate area, especially west of the Hudson River, one of which is very notable when you're driving on the thruway north, you'll see what's called today the Clove furnace, or during its better part of its operation, the Greenwood number 2 furnace. It's number 2 because number 1 is just up the valley from there. The number 1 was a charcoal furnace, similar in dimensions to the West Point Foundry's blast furnace. Number 2 was an anthracite furnace during most of its operation. So the foundry was very keen to vertically integrate backwards. They were happy to want to generate their own supply. For no reasons we have seen stated particularly, but it can be inferred that they needed to keep a good eye on quality. Since they're making cannon for the Navy and later, of course, the Army, they've got to do a lot of proving, and they knew that maintaining a good quality of pig iron was essential to them to fulfill contract after contract after contract. So, anyways.
One thing just to mention, because we'll come back to this, there's a dam at the top of the property. It looks very, very tall and imposing, and it is very tall, but the valley itself continues to go up. So the dam itself is not holding back huge amounts of water, but that's their very handy and powerful potential power source up there.
So beyond cannon, they're also making, they've gotten pretty serious in the 1820s and the 30s into making marine engines. And based on some research I was doing for the National Historic Landmark nomination, we'll get on to be 9 years ago, came around the number that during the 1830s and the 40s, they had captured about 10% of the marine engine market, both for river transport, coastal, and some ocean going, which is a pretty significant share, and they were respected for it. Despite what you see here in the burning of the Lexington and Long Island Sound, it wasn't their engine that necessarily was the problem, it was the boiler, but they had made the engines for several notable vessels on the water. And they would also had a kind of a reputation here. You can see in this schedule from, I think I clipped this out of, I think it was a newspaper. This is one of those things they would just pass around to various other newspapers. I think this was from a newspaper in Iowa of the period. They would just share this kind of schedule information, but they, talked up the West Point Foundry making the engine for the Cleveland here. So, oh, this is a great one here. So marine engines, they're doing good enough trade that in the 1850s, they are securing contracts with the U.S. Navy. And so, Steve, you can probably speak to this a little bit better than I, but by 1853, 54, the U.S. Navy has decided on building 6 single-decker frigates in somewhat response to British and French naval buildup. And some of those names are pretty well known. Niagara, Congress, Minnesota, I think, and the Merrimack. And this is the engine for the Merrimack. They had got the contract for it. It is I'm going to butcher what the arrangement of the engine is, what it's called. It's a trunked engine. It operates with the cylinders in a horizontal configuration. There are two, and they're 6 foot in diameter. This is a line drawing that's in the U.S. Archives, and it was found by an author, last name Kinnaman, who wrote a pretty thick book about the Merrimack purely as the Merrimack, not its later history as the Virginia. So this is the engine that's on the Merrimack, and that pretty pronounced entablature there of West Point Foundry is pretty cool. And when he showed me this in 2016, 17, and ironically, I was living in Houston and he was there too. I was like, oh, this is cool. Let's get together and talk about it. And I was pretty blown away. And he was gracious enough to share the full, a pretty high resolution TIFF that he'd gotten from the archives. So.
But this is a good sort of the pivot, because by 1850, West Point Foundry becomes the go-to for effectively one-off important things for the government. So, for example, in 1850, the New York Navy Yard in Brooklyn is building a new dry dock, and they call up the river, as it were. They really call in New York to the main business office and say, hey, could you build the world's largest pumping engine to drain our dry dock? And so the West Point Foundry is quite happy to do so. And that stayed and worked probably until the 1910s or teens. Still haven't found any good equivalent drawings, but this seems to be the secondary pumping engine and the boiler. Just to remind you that they did do a lot of that kind of duller ironwork. Of course, cannon was their mainstay. They made most of their money from cannon, effectively. And so I assume this is the raised from the monitor? Aaron?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
It is. Yep.
Just double checking. So, fun factoid, right? When the USS Merrimack, which was then burned in Gosport Naval Yard, and when was raised by the Confederates, rechristened the CSS Virginia as an ironclad, we still call it, the North then still called it the Merrimack. Anyway, when the Monitor and the Merrimack met off the coast of Hampton Roads and fired each other, you had West Point Foundry engines driving one boat and West Point Foundry cannons firing at it from the other boat. And of course, the actual conflict was a bit of a draw, but West Point Foundry is everywhere.
Yeah, the West Point Foundry in 1859 produced these two 11-inch Dahlgren guns, and one of which you see here on the right they're both of which are being conserved at the conservation lab at Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia. Again, highly recommend go. What an outstanding exhibit. It's almost overwhelming how much they're doing there. And we'll be going there again next year for the SIA annual conference it'll be hosted in Norfolk. So.
Into May.
And oh yeah, this is a smashing one as it is. I believe this photograph was taken May 1st, 1864 on the gun testing platform at the West Point Foundry. Here they're testing the biggest cannon they could possibly produce at the period, a 300-pounder Parrott. It's a pretty remarkable show, but I'll really point to you what is, I think, the most remarkable thing about this photograph are the hats. Everybody is wearing a different hat. It's almost like they had a memo that day. I mean, some of them were kind of close, but what a great hat shop there must have been in Cold Spring for everyone to really make sure they all had their own distinct hat. So,
sorry, I didn't get the memo. I was supposed to wear a hat.
Yeah.
Okay, let us finally move on to the archaeology, which
The archaeology.
hopefully is what you came for. So the West Point Foundry, functionally as a foundry, is effectively out of business by about 1905, 1909. There's a sort of holding company that goes on. Some other uses are on the site in the before World War I and between the wars, but from about 1920 or so onward, nature is reclaiming it. After World War II, just up the road outside the property, Marathon Battery Company built a battery processing plant. That didn't affect the West Point Foundry at all, but what it did was it started to poison everything. So, if I get this right here.
With cadmium, to be exact, they were making aerospace application batteries. for I think for U.S. government uses. So a lot of cadmium, nickel cadmium batteries were being made, and so the cadmium is flowing into Foundry Cove for
Yep.
decades.
So, and Aaron, you have to this. I'm assuming Rutsch did this mapping for these when the property changed hands.
Yeah, I think this was done. It was under the Ralph Brill report in 1979, 78, 79, with the idea that the property was going to be redeveloped, I think, into like a hybrid hotel space, hotel funland, foundry funland or something. Pat,
Hmm.
you might remember some of this conversation. You may have been privy to things that you got from other folks, but this is beginning the era, the 1970s, and there was just in the previous slide, I don't have to go back, Steve, but like I had mentioned earlier, 1973, on the left side there, the West Point Foundry is listed as a above ground resource in the National Register of Historic Places. The NHPA is passed in 1966, and so there's a flurry of activity of listing as much as possible. And the Foundry gets on with a nomination form that's only 4 pages long. We don't do that anymore. They're multiple pages long. There's so much to go on about it, but it got it on the map for historic preservation. And so go back on there, Steve.
So the first in modern sense of archaeology, at least documentation, is Ed Rutsch, noted New York City, New York area, but living in the city, industrial archaeologist. That gets things going, but in terms of moving dirt, as far as I understand it, not much happened there. However, in the 1990s, that Marathon battery plant, we're now looking from the north, sort of to the south, the foundry's down in the valley here. I don't really know what was going on here. This is the edge of the cove.
Junkyard.
Junk down there, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, this is the battery plant area that was leaching cadmium into the Foundry Cove, Hudson River. And so the whole thing became a Superfund site. And Joel Grossman and his team did some selected archaeology on what we now call the West Point Foundry site. Points of that will be coming up in a minute. So the point is that this trigger of cleaning up the mess that Marathon had made was adjacent to West Point Foundry, but for the happiness of industrial archaeologists everywhere, wasn't actually much on the site itself, and certainly not in its historic core. I think I got this wrong. Scenic Hudson Land Trust purchased the property in '96. I hadn't looked that up. And then at the Society for Historical Archaeology conference in 2001, out in Long Beach, Alan Rickman, Alan Newman, who was I guess consultant for Scenic Hudson at that point, or maybe working for them. Anyway, was reacting to this Disneyland Foundry World crazy proposal. And someone wisely at that meeting said, "Oh, you've got an industrial site? You should go talk to Pat Martin." And so Alan and Pat met and chatted on the Queen Mary, which led to further meetings and connections and the way things snowball for the next decade almost. Michigan Tech ran summerfield schools out there, funded. I was just sort of, while I was driving, I want to say it was 18 graduate students doing their thesis or part of thesis out there. Some who were there, but their thesis was on something else. Anyway, this is why we've got a generation of industrial archaeologists that cut their teeth there, like Aaron. Bit of a pause after that. Scenic Hudson did some stabilization and put in walking paths, some interpretive stuff. Aaron at that time was working for a private CRM firm and happened to be living in the next town north. And so he happily was able to help guide a lot of that, which was great. Monitor as further things came out of the ground. In 2019, I guess finally it was.
2019 ASME designation, landmark designation. The NHL is 2021.
That makes more sense. And then so I helped shepherd through the ASME landmark, and then Aaron, in his actually corporate guise, shepherd through the NHL designation. And so this is now more than recognized as a very important space. But this is what was there once. This is looking down the valley from up, sort of the furnace would be off to your right, but it was full. There were factory buildings everywhere. In the Cornell period, it was just full. On the left, probably Civil War-ish era. The
Mhm.
bottom right one is the certainly Civil War one that had grown out of, there's a sort of 1930s, early 1930s woodcut of the site. All of that had been effectively untouched, despite EPA, despite everything, other than presumably scrapping drives for World War II. All that archaeology is under there. There's what the Cornell works looked like.
And interestingly, part of the reason why the West Point Foundry is going to end about 1909 is, if you back up, Steve, is that bridge shop is actually what's going to doom them. They had bought on, they were doing pretty good business at the end in manufacturing sort of erector set types of bridges for municipalities all over the land that had become these kind of bridges we now we find eligible or list in the National Register. We fight about because we want to save them. They were doing a good job. The Cornells were in making those. Well, they had about $1 million worth of stock on hand, which they had bought from the Bethlehem Steel Company. And then the panic of 1907 hit. And a lot of municipalities, their ability to issue bonds to build those type of bridges fell through. And therefore, a lot of bridge making operations had to slow down or pause, and it caught a lot of folks in the lurch. And that's what killed the situation for the Cornells in maintaining the West Point Foundry.
Yeah, and for those who are bridge people, remember that the American Bridge Company consolidation was 1901. So out of the East
right.
Coast, manufacturers like this were being squeezed by the Midwestern ones who could
Yep.
get steel a lot cheaper. But now we're off topic. It's a big site. So let's get on to the archaeology. If I understand the photo archive here on a hard drive, this is the first testing done in 2001, where they did a bunch of core samples on the site to figure out what might be there. And Pat can correct me if not, but that's what it says on the file record. Michigan Tech arrives, I believe the first summer field school was 2002, although that was mostly just basic surveying. I think that was the year Liz Norris was sent around to all the archives to find out what was out there. These are a number of different field schools. 2002 at the top, small crew. 2000, is it 5 and 6, I think, are the other two?
Four is on the left,
Four
five
is
is on the lower right.
Okay. And there's a flyer for the field school. And so for a number of years, we were running, Michigan Tech was running crews with, oh yeah, there's Aaron right there, right in the middle.
Yep.
And they're up by the dam. Running crews of anywhere from 10 to 15, or I think what was the largest, maybe 18 students one year.
When we had the Earthwatch volunteers, it was like up into 20, like almost 50. It was a lot of people.
Yeah. So this is what they were up against. And Aaron, just jump in. I visited a couple times. I was teaching at Penn State at the time, but Aaron was there for two seasons, and then afterwards, this is the state things we're in some of the cases.
Interestingly, the photo on the left, that's actually the boiler shop that we never really did much with. That's a very later Cornell period, and it's still, some of that is still standing. It's right when you enter the property. It was there. Archaeologically, there weren't a lot of questions really to be asked of it. It was just the ruin of a boiler. The boiler for, well, I mean, it was more used for the Astoria Silkworks. Again, there's questions there to be answered, but we didn't get much into that.
And then there were, gaping holes of death, of curiosity, like, ooh, what's down there? But as you can see, the nature and trees of nearly 100 years have taken over at this point.
Yep.
Everybody there, I will speak for them. They moved a lot of dirt.
Yes.
As Aaron filling his bucket on the left. Many people digging in there. I'm not sure even which site that is.
That's in the middle. That's the we're backfilling the blast furnace site at that point. That's a lovely day, and we're trying to hack through all the dirt we'd already moved. So you gotta fill back in areas you've excavated for multiple good reasons.
Yeah, I see Pat there hacking away with a mattock, so I wasn't sure about that. And then, of course, volunteer upon volunteer upon volunteer, including myself, screening stuff and saying, "Hey, what's this? Hey, what's this?" as it comes out. A big chunk of the project, as I watched the theses come through, was recordation of this. Some of it was very low tech. Some of it was very, very high tech for the time. Ground penetrating radar on the bottom there, drafting board to the left, EDM surveying to the right. This is pre-LiDAR, at least as far as Michigan Tech had access to it. So I don't think any of that was done.
I'll add here too that, there's a lot to talk about with this, but as I said, we collectively, and those of us who went through that program under Pat's guidance, learned a lot just by blood, sweat, and tears. We knew we could use a total station there on the right to do some overall general recordation, but one of the other thesis students who graduated who went through the program 2 years later, who now teaches with Michigan Tech, Dan Treppel, he and I independently came to the idea that, yeah, total stations are pretty great, and you can lock in like unit corners and big features, but it's still a big utility to do plan drawings like you see in the lower left. They're not going away. You still have to do things with that can then supplement the more whiz bang kind of things. Even if you're using a phone to record things to do kind of the sort of like handheld type of recordation where it gives you a 3D model of something. That's cool. But the plan drawings that you do down there are just as good at a certain scale as what you can do with any other device. I don't see that going away. There's still a distinct value in that and being able to like capture those measurements, use your eyes, talk amongst each other, share ideas, and record that way. So that's something we all learned from that and carry through to this day. That's not going away. So
Just a quick response if people are going to have to leave. Dan Snyder, yes, this is being recorded. We'll edit it up and just watch the SIA YouTube channel at some point. Honestly, not before the holidays, but at some point it'll be there. And the major manuscripts, the family manuscripts are now at the New York State Archives. Some of the corporate records are at the New York State Historical Society, and then others are scattered all over the place. Some of the people took their records, some are at the University of Virginia, some are at the Library of Congress, some are at apparently at State Archives in Richmond. Haven't seen those yet, but anyway. Okay, so all of that surveying and recording and stuff created a base map. And the only reason I specifically wanted to add this here is to show there is just so much stuff to potentially look at. And over the years, I have to admit, Michigan Tech students took on a whole lot of very different projects to get, what would you call it, glimpses of an overview. But there's, nothing has been done to death for certain. There's some of that hand recording. The one on the right I like in particular is you see at the top the actual hand sketch that was done of, in this case, the East Bank House. And then on the right is what it turns into when it's computerized. It's not even digitized. It's redrawn on the computer. And all those forms, excavation forms, are filled out and kept for later. Tons of stratigraphy and things, cross sections, drawings done. I simply added these in because you'll notice the little yellow arrows all point to the fact that I did it. So I actually did do some help for moving dirt and taking photos, but that pretty much is it for my particular stuff. But here's where all the archaeology happened. The red dots are the Michigan Tech works, and basically there was effectively a thesis came out of every red dot, more or less. The orange ones are from the Superfund sites, and you'll notice they're just on the periphery. The arrow to the top left with the orange one is the Marathon site itself. The one down at the what's labeled Carpenter Shop, that was right on the edge of the marsh for pollution there, and they did more work in the marsh itself. For some reason, they also looked at some of the houses up there on what's known as Vinegar Hill.
that was the Hall Road. They needed to mitigate those as well because they had to blitz through that. So it was all that was done under Section 106 mitigation because the site was already determined, it was already listed in National Register, and so they had to mitigate for adverse effects that the Superfund cleanup was going to do to the portions of the site that it touched. So.
Yep. And then that sort of stray red dot at the bottom, slightly right, is the East Bank House, not on this map, but it was probably, I guess everybody agrees, very likely the superintendent's house, William Young's house.
Early on, yeah.
And then became a boarding house. So an interesting domestic site in an industrial context. And the yellow dots Aaron suggested are like, if you win the lottery, you're going back for the Ford shop and the machine shop.
For sure. Yeah. Saul, thanks, Saul, for putting that question in the chat. Definitely the machine shop and the Ford shop, we didn't get into much, but they have a great deal of likely integrity. And a lot of those the machine shop doesn't get going until the late 1830s, early 1840s, when they consolidate the Manhattan site to Cold Spring. But that likely, there's some good enough integrity there that it probably captures some aspects of machine shop work of that period that you're not going to find many other places that would be really great to look at from an archaeological perspective. Same deal with the forge shop. I'll also just add that the furnace, while we scratched at it, still needs a lot more work done, but we need to go in there with mechanical equipment. Like humans can only move so much dirt and rock. We need some people in there, or need some equipment in there. And the current construction manager, sites manager for Scenic Hudson, Joe Kiernan, who's a fantastic guy to have in your side to get work done at places like this. We both want to get back in there and and effectively mine a lot of the rubble out, partly to help reinforce the brook up there, because since what was it, Tropical Storm Irene in 2011, the brook is starting to eat at the site. So we need some support up there. But it's not just to get rock out of there, but we want to do more archaeology up there. So
Good segue without knowing it, because one of the most important, from my point of view as a former engineer, fascinating things about this is the whole water system for this. This is a wonderful example of integrated hydraulics running shop after shop. There's an upper dam, there's an upper, it's called the battery pond, as in a place to store energy, same idea, batteries, and leats that run things. There's a section, and I should have noted on this previous one, the red line with the dotted line, the water system comes down over the water wheel, then goes underground, a little unclear exactly where it goes, and then it comes out way down at the bottom there, down by the marsh. This was one of the very first master's theses done by Kim Finch on just trying to figure out what the water system was. And that's sort of the background for a lot of this, a lot of future work. In particular, I'll point out the thing I really liked here is that she put attention, whether Pat suggested or whoever did, what is the head, the fall at the various places for the useful power that they could have gotten out? A very important question that often gets missed. Let's see, Dan Treppel in 2006, seven, did the casting house where Weir's gun furnace painting is. These are things they found, the edge of the casting pit, etc. And there's a good overview of what was done. And so just if you think about how much dirt had to come out of there and how much work, there's a rail system over here for moving things. I assume that's the base of an air furnace.
I'm not sure. Well, that's immediately to the left of that is the base of a cupola furnace, and those are the columns that supported the furnace that had toppled over. Chunk of which you now have in the annex there. But I'm not sure what that brick. You'd have to ask Dan. I'm not sure what that served. I don't. It could have been the base of a smaller air furnace, but I don't know.
But so that's the major production site. 2 years before that was Rachel's thesis. Anyway,
Yes.
Worked on this big face lathe thing, face lathe room. This is what's left of it, with very nasty tree intrusions, root intrusions, but reconstructing what was going on. As I understood it, this glass plate negative effectively only came to her attention halfway through the project. So, but then had it to match up. There's a extensive glass plate negative collection up at Putnam History Museum, which they have digitized all now. So there's lots of good photographic evidence.
That kind of blew our minds. And I remember us standing there with that photograph, and I believe we found a handle that you see, or a handle very much like one of the ones you see next to the jib crane that was detachable, so you could take it off and maneuver things. So it was that was pretty fortuitous to find that at the time. Yeah.
Here's Aaron's space.
Yeah, and this looks into the casting arch of the furnace, and we were able to. This is as much as what 5 people could do over the course of about 4 to 5 weeks of excavating down. The furnace, as we'd mentioned before, is 40 feet tall, truncated down to about 7.5 feet. Most of the stone was scavenged after the furnace was closed and taken elsewhere. Some of it fell around, but what we did find was that the casting bed is very intact, and there's a lot more to be looked at there. One of the more interesting finds for this, and this was open to some interpretation, we excavated through the sand as much as we could there, and you see on the right. And I remember standing on this very not reinforced sidewall up above, and one of the people I was working with was Cameron Hartnell, who was one of the first PhD graduates in the IAH program, who he and Liz Liz Hartnell, Norris, will now live in Australia. Cameron looked up at me and said, "I'm finding bones and ceramics." I'm like, "What are you finding down there?" And it's a combination of bones, like a bone from it was mutton, some a teal or a duck, and a interestingly broken pieces of a flask, a green flask that was of a Masonic design. My interpretation, and Pat and Tim Scarlett and I kind of went around about this in my thesis, is that this could be the remains of a party that was held when the furnace stack was completed, but before the sand was put in place, like a potluck. Smash stuff. It all lands down there and the sand comes in. I don't know. Fight me on it. I don't care. Maybe it was just from the lunches, but it was enough of a concentrated find that I thought this is curious. This seems like this may have been like a, what do you call it today, a topping event when you finish a building and they put a Christmas tree at the top to like celebrate the end. It may have been an event like that, and it would have been pretty remarkable when they finished this 40-foot tall, likely at the time tallest blast furnace in the United States, overlooking the whole site, and they have a party and all the stuff gets smashed and left down at the bottom. I don't know. Again, it's archaeology. It's open to some interpretation, but it was a pretty remarkable find for the site, I thought.
So just so you know what Aaron was dealing with, and then also Aaron Timms, who was doing the blowing engine just above, there's Chapman's painting. And if you imagine standing on the dam where that little diamond is, you'd be looking down at the blowing engine in the front, closest to you here, roughly where the person in red is, and then on beyond up to the right is the remains of what's left of the stack and the casting stuff over there. So it's pretty distressed, but it's all still there because other than trees, nothing else grown on top of it. And I left that there. Artifacts. Oh, heavens, did they get a lot of artifacts. I meant to go down into the basement storage and show just how many racks of stuff. There are lots and lots of iron artifacts. There are wood artifacts. There are domestic ceramic, glass, etc. There were some things like leather and botanicals. Those who've run their course and aren't really no good shape anymore.
In the pile there on the left, interestingly, the square item you see there, that's an anchor plate for the blast furnace. They had a series of plates going up the side. If you're familiar with blast furnace, you know you needed to use tie rods to bind the stonework and keep it together. And we managed to find at least one, if not another. And just above it there, you see that boomerang looking item. That's a cast pig that's in a bent shape. Don't know if it's intentional, not sure, but we ended up testing that and getting some data off of that to characterize the carbon content and the other both major and minor elements. And it turned out it was definitely charcoal iron for that particular piece and low enough sulfur that it wouldn't make a bad casting. But that was a pretty fortuitous find there.
Just so you know, all know, we're nearly done. There are some beautiful and signature items that were found, presumably from one of the jib cranes. Cast and wrought iron trolley that's there. I don't think that's been conserved further, but I think it's worth conserving further. There was three pigs total. Here's one with a casting date on it.
Yeah.
1828.
Very early.
One of the earliest ones. One is, I believe, still in our basement. One is at the Putnam History Museum, and I'm not sure where the third one is, but anyway. There was some pretty good PR at the time. For example, we won't call it a cover story, but mentioned on the cover of American Archaeology in fall of 2004, Understanding 19th Century Industry. Got a nice, I think, 7-page spread there. Numerous public outreach events at the site, archaeology days, hosting people to come down and things like that. Just as a little bit of a plug, there was a 2009 IA theme issue. These are the articles there with excellent article from Forest to Mine and Foundry and Cannons by Mr.
Thank you.
Kotlinski. So that's out there. I have to say that there hasn't been a whole lot more of the archaeology from the site, which has made it out into print. It's the usual problem with maybe all archaeology. I'll speak as a historian, watching archaeologists, you all get on to next projects, and getting that thing written up doesn't always happen. But there's that. And today, beautiful place to visit, really any season. Scenic Hudson has built this, what would you call that, Aaron? A interpretation?
Yeah, I like Pat's calling that part of a part of a pie. It's
Yeah.
it's a cool ghosting of the up to scale of the 36-foot diameter backshot water wheel that powered the inside of the boring mill, provided power to the machine shop as well. Yeah.
Yep. And they have, if it's assuming it's still working, a fairly nice GPS sort of phone tour as you walk around. It can tell you stories about the different buildings. I don't know, Aaron, have they done it much more in the way of interpretation there in the last 10 years?
No, not really. They're just doing a lot of site maintenance. As a matter of fact, it's an ongoing thing. I have a conversation with Joe Kiernan about them. Oh, you've been on the emails about them removing the concrete bridge to the office building. So it's an active part of their maintenance program, but at the moment they don't have much in the way of doing more work. So
Yeah. And I believe we merely have to thank people here, Scenic Hudson, obviously, for taking this on and helping fund much of this. The program here, and especially Pat Martin, who made it happen. I'd like to thank Susan West, who is the great-great-granddaughter of William Kemble, and her family for preserving all the family papers, 17 boxes worth. Actually, 18 boxes, because 17 went to the New York State Archives. One box of specifically Foundry stuff went to Putnam History Museum, and Putnam History Museum has probably, these are bankers boxes, probably another 2 to 3 bankers boxes worth of West Point Foundry related things. So if you wanted to study the family history, it's wonderful. Not as much technical stuff out there as we could hope. At any rate, we thank you for your attention. I will stop the share. We have some questions here, which some can Aaron can answer better than I can. There we go. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending. I hope you understand our enthusiasm for this place. It's not going away. So Dan, you ask, how do you treat or preserve iron artifacts? So, well, there's a couple things you can do. If you don't have the resources, you just want to keep them as stable as possible, keep them in climate controlled conditions. But if you want to take it to the next step, one of the things we did with the Michigan Tech focus on the West Point Foundry was did a good bit of electrolysis on stuff that was of more importance, including it was either 1828 pig or the 1827 pig, where you just do, if you're familiar with it, where you put it in a bath of electrolyte and run a current through it to subtract the corrosion to a point. It'll keep going. You can take all the iron out, but you transfer that to a sacrificial anode. And so we did some of that. And I've done that now personally in my own house. I'll find iron stuff, interesting stuff, and just stabilize it that way. Yeah, that's kind of a thumbnail version of what we happened there. So
Actually, let me pop in for a second.
Sure.
So this is, I think, our first presentation that actually covered actual industrial archaeology, where people got their hands dirty. Not everyone, but it's all together. And if anyone has any suggestions for other speakers who can talk about iron and steel archaeology projects where people got their hands dirty, please let me know. I will get them on the calendar because I think there's a lot of interest in this. So thank you guys for such a great talk. And let me turn it back to you so you can answer any remaining questions.
Yeah, I was wheeling through the questions here. Lee, you asked, and thanks for joining us, Lee. How long did foundry workers live when pouring? And feel free to take yourself off mute and just verbally ask the question too.
Yes, thanks. That looked extraordinarily dangerous, having been in several SIA tours near molten metal. Did they do a lot of replacement of workers, or
Yeah.
did these guys work for 5 or 10 or 20 years, or did they not last very long?
Well, we don't have like hard statistics about that. I don't know. Maybe Steve, you've run anything. I don't know of any fatalities at the foundry.
That seems highly unusual.
Well, I think it's easy to conflate what's happening in a place like the West Point Foundry before the 1870s versus what's going to happen with big steelmaking plants later. They're different animals in a lot of ways. There's possible for death, I would say, But we do know there are plenty of injuries. And there was a person who interned with Scenic Hudson, I think, in the MTU years, who had a grandfather, a great grandfather, who worked at the foundry and lost his arm, and she had a photograph and brought it. So those kinds of kind of commonplace industrial accidents of the period probably had what happened with some regularity. Steve, they had a doctor on staff, right? Wasn't
They did. He also married a Kemble daughter. Yeah.
right.
So
So
yeah, they had a company doctor who was a very highly regarded New York doctor who married into the family, moved up there, Frederick Lente, Lente, and was on call at all times. So from in modern terms, they effectively had their own health plan. Um, there was a sort of insurance system in general. Um, I've never done a full census, but of the notices in the newspapers where industrial accidents happened, it's far more likely of lost arm or even just, hand was crushed or something like that.
Here in Wilmington, given the DuPont powder works, basically, since the powder would blow up and the
Yep.
roof would come off, and they put it right back on, but there were widows and orphans pensions. So that killed a lot of people. But to get employment going, they paid a long time stipend to the widow and her children. I also had a very early, very rookie question, wondering if the casting originally included a giant hole or an attempted hole for the open barrel, or whether they needed to bore the entirety of the open portion of the cannon.
Okay. So first on the comparison to DuPont, that's somewhat a similar answer to Aaron's comment about big steel later. Old iron furnaces, charcoal or even anthracite, are not particularly dangerous. It's quite hard for them to, in any sense, blow up. I will say, I'm really astounded, given what the water table is there, that anyone decided to put an iron furnace, sorry, a casting pit. Iron furnace is further up, but a casting pit that you'd cast from the cupola straight into what clearly is saturated groundwater. But they must have had nicely tight flasks and all that. The cannon at this point are all bored. Early on, they are bored from the solid, which is to say they're cast solid and bored out entirely. With the Rodman process, you get the core put in because by then they can actually locate the core reliably. The problem if the core gets off center, you've got a wonky cannon and have to recast it. One thing I was going to mention in the picture of the gun foundry, right next to the apparatus for the Rodman central cooling core, there's a workman there who's holding a rope sitting on an old, probably 32-pounder. And those are the old cannon that are going into the furnace to be remelted, to be recast into the modern stuff. That transition is happening about 1850. But before that, it would have been poured and then bored from the solid without a core.
and after Lee's first question, there was a question about how did they avoid, from Dan Snyder again, how did they avoid the boring rod sagging in a horizontal arrangement versus a vertical arrangement?
It's just really, really stiff is the answer. Well, in most boring systems for the earlier part of the West Point Foundry, it's the cannon that rotates and the boring bar is fixed. And so the cannon actually just rotates on, well, roller bearings in essence. And the very stiff cast iron rod with a boring head on the front of it works its way in. So it's not, apparently it wasn't too much of a problem. As I understand it, the big challenge moving to horizontal boring machines was more about being able to get the cannon reliably rotating, driving the cannon and getting it rotating on the fixed boring bar. And it was a challenge, that's for sure. There appear to be, this is not West Point Foundry because it's a generation before, but there are competing attempts of the Maritz system from France and the Wilkinson system from England, both arriving in America in either the Revolution or 1790s, depends, but that's a different talk for a different day.
T. Harris asked, after the closure of the blast furnace, where did the foundry source its pig iron from? So I glossed over it pretty quickly, but the foundry maintained ownership of those two other furnaces well, actually three, but they closed one at about the same time. The two furnaces on the other side of the Hudson River over in effectively was Harriman State Park today. The Greenwood #1 and #2 furnaces. Well, Greenwood #1, they purchased in the 1820s, along with another furnace nearby they built called the Woodbury furnace. And they maintained that as its trio with the Cold Spring blast furnace operation. The 1830s, late 1830s, in the 1840s is a bit of a struggle for the foundry because of a little bit of the long tail of the Panic of 1837, and then the tariff conversations and debates of the 1840s. So there's this period in which domestic manufacturers are pretty well protected, and then after 1846, I can't remember my dates on this, Steve, when the tariff abominations goes through after, or no, the other way around, it goes away, I think, yeah. Those protections drop, and suddenly Scotch pig iron and a lot of British pig iron that is of suitable quality comes in. The foundry scratches their chin and they say, well, we'll sideline the West Point Foundry blast furnace, the one we talked about. They don't tear it down right away. They just stop using it for while it's idle, per a Putnam history written in 1848, 49. It's still standing at that point, but it's the period. Then it was common to take a blast furnace out of operation and put it back into operation 5-10 years later. But at that time, they're still sourcing pig iron from their furnace, from the Greenwood 1 furnace. Greenwood 2 isn't built until the 1850s. And they also seem to be buying iron on the open market because of that same book. William Blake's Putnam County History of 1849 says that they found it cheaper to buy it abroad, which I don't think that necessarily means, well, it could mean it's purchased from abroad. It just means it's bought from elsewhere. So they play the market to their benefit.
Yep. One other thing that goes beyond this particular site that Aaron and I are always talking about is West Point Foundry is an incredible training ground for American engineers in 1830s, 40s, 50s, and huge diaspora of all these people. So, for example, you mentioning the 1842 tariff iron issue. By that time, William Young has, in a sense, left the foundry, but they've got an adjacent, separately owned, but they seem to be running it, rolling mill up in Saugerties, New York. And he's also been called down to Western Maryland in Mount Savage, building a rolling mill down there, which gets completely, financially speaking, destroyed by the 1842 tariffs. Other of the engineers have gone on to build railway shops, major foundries. One of the apprentices of who worked with the West Point Foundry, who immediately was named Isaac Newton, went on to be a assistant engineer on the USS Monitor, and then was also involved with not Burden, Hoboken guy, Stevens. Stevens's work on ironclads and machine shops there. So just the connections that flow through West Point Foundry are quite astounding.
Yeah, one of the things is the advent of newspapers.com, which has been around a while, but the ability to search a lot of obituaries has been really remarkable, because we'll search West Point Foundry and so, and we'll find these people we've never heard of before who later on went on to have pretty remarkable careers after their time at the West Point Foundry. And there'll be remarks like so-and-so took their training, took their education at the West Point Foundry, and went on to like really be rock stars in various foundry machine shop operations from like Philly and West. One person in particular I thought was really interesting, guy named David Miller, who apprenticed and worked for a while at the forge shop at the West Point Foundry, comes here to Pittsburgh, sets up a place called the Duquesne Forge in what is basically now Point State Park, does a pretty good business, good enough he needs to expand, gets out of the city and goes up the river to Rankin, just next to what is now the Cary Furnace Complex, and expands his Duquesne Forge there. He passes on. And then later that place does well enough, it's picked up by McClintock Marshall as their heavy fabrication shop there. And things like the Panama Canal lock gates are built there, put on a barge and sent down the river. So it's things like that where the West Point Foundry just has this very quiet, like Steve said, diaspora of talent that it goes across the landscape that we're just now kind of getting our heads wrapped around. So.
And also their products are going as far south as the mid-Caribbean, as far north as mining operations up here, as far west in the early phase, I know, as New Orleans for cotton gins and cotton presses,
Yeah.
all up and down the East Coast. They're one of their big sidelines we didn't mention were sugar production machineries. In the end, that they lost out to the Scottish manufacturers on that one. And I think also they pivoted so hard into ordnance that
Yeah.
they couldn't keep up for that. Lighthouses after steel structures, lighthouses. In fact, there's one up here in the UP, and I finally visited at Whitefish Point Lighthouse. The thing I find fascinating is it's a sort of a tinker toy sort of thing, but even more than that, each bar is stamped or cast, I should say, with a number. So it's a number 2 bar, and it fits a number 2 socket, which tells me they had a whole size range of things, and there are at least 4 of those surviving across the country. I don't know if they're all number 2 size or not.
Hmm.
But
Okay, well, perhaps we should call it an evening now that it is evening. So thank you so much, Steve and Aaron, for a great talk. And stay tuned for our speaker next month, Jet Low on December 18th. So hope to see you all next month.